Okay, we're now going to hear the perspective from the European Medicines Agency, and I'm happy to introduce you to Francesco Pignatti. He is the scientific advisor for oncology at the European Medicines Agency. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. When planning for this talk, initially we thought that it would be early on in the program, so forgive me if it's a bit conceptual, but I think the most important aspect is to really frame correctly what we mean by doing benefit-risk assessment. And if you look at the legislation for a definition, it doesn't go very far. So the purpose of this talk is really to explain a little bit what are the views of what we consider to be a benefit-risk assessment in the regulatory context. And you're going to hear my views. I'm going to try to paint the picture, including also other views, but there is a certain individual views here that I'm going to explain. And I think if you see the drug regulator doing a benefit-risk assessment and deciding whether that drug is good or bad, that is the wrong way of looking at it. I would say if we continue in this sort of simplified framework for the sake of the definition, I would say regulators don't do benefit-risk assessment at all. They don't balance risk against benefits to decide whether the balance is positive or not, but rather, and this is the important distinction, they consider if there are patients in the right decision context, and we can expand what that means later, who consider the benefit risk to be positive or who consider the drug to be better than placebo. So what I'm trying to underline here, it's not trivializing the role of the regulator at all, but it's a role of scrutinizing the data, describing the data as accurately as possible, and determining if legitimate value judgments by patients and doctors, for simplification, exist that consider those benefits and harms to lead to a positive balance of benefits and risk. Now, when I present this, some think it's obvious, it's almost banal as a statement, and others think it's outrageous. And this really reflects different views, which to some extent you have in the regulatory system, which is either a more paternalistic view of the regulator, no, the drug regulator, yes, we should listen, get information from all the stakeholders, but in the end, we should decide what's good for Europe or not. And other views, let me call them less paternalistic or more, I don't know, patient-centric, whatever, decision-maker-centric, who will, rather than make the benefit-risk assessment ourselves, will look at legitimate decision makers, whether they consider the balance to be positive or not. Okay? So I think this is the key distinction that underlines the way many of us look at benefit risk assessment. And now, why is this necessary? Well, because balancing benefit and risk has an inherent subjective components, referred to as value judgments, expert judgment, and so on. And those value judgments depend on the subject. And then one needs to take a perspective, and which one is the legitimate perspective? We have hundreds of organizations who have different views on this, millions of patients who have different views on it, and doctors, and so on. So what would be a plausible single framework that the regulators would take to say, okay, we're deciding for Europe based on that? And so unless we had an open social debate and there was a unified agreement on a certain value to give to this endpoint or the other or to this difference, it would be implausible for a European regulator to decide for everyone. And equally, taking then the local context with different standard of cares, different drugs which are available and so on, the idea that only the best drugs should be approved becomes very difficult to even ascertain what best according to what criterion, according to what endpoints and so on. So don't see this as a trivialization of the role of the regulators. On the contrary, I think the key task of the regulator is to assess the technical requirements to make sure that we can communicate what the data show and the uncertainties, but then whether these data fulfill societal goals or whatever goals any organization in the healthcare system decides to follow, then this has to be decided in the right context. And similarly, the context of doctors and physicians is very different from a situation to situation. So I like to talk not about a regulator approving drugs as in endorsing drugs as good for the European public, but as giving a marketing authorization if the data are scrutinized in a certain and are sufficiently, let's say, clear to establish that they fulfill the legal requirements for authorization. And if you look at all of the different authorizations that we have, the conditional, the exceptional, the standard, the non-standard, it might seem all a bit random, but actually it makes a lot of sense if you look at the different authorization pathways we have from the point of view of managing uncertainty. And this simplified diagram shows you how, a flow chart shows you how if you have a positive benefit risk under the definition that I gave before, or perhaps any other definition if you are, let's say, in a different camp, then do you still have key existing uncertainties? No, that's a standard approval. But if you do have remaining uncertainties, well, can they be solved? Do they fulfill the criteria for a situation that qualifies for a conditional market authorization? Yes, then that becomes a possible pathways and so on for exceptional circumstances. So you see, a useful way to look at uncertainties is something that can guide to the different approvals. And the different approvals really are almost a communication tool to highlight the levels of uncertainties. And we actually often get criticized for what is the type of approval that notoriously comes with the largest amount of uncertainties. And we asked our regulators, we did a survey, we asked the regulators, well, how do your trade-offs change or the perceived trade-offs of patients and physician in the right decision context change on the benefit risk assessment? What makes you accept conditional marketing authorization more? What came out are two things. One is that the uncertainties should be well understood by patient and doctors. And the other thing, that the uncertainties should be reduced as quickly as possible. So these are the things that we're thinking of at the moment. How can we improve communication? How we can get faster answers to the uncertainties which are considered key. And in terms of communications, I've put in the gray box in the upper, left corner, the benefit risk assessment as it was described for a drug in 1999. And in 2016, we have a much more comprehensive description. Well, in German, how do you say, in die Kürze liegt die Würze, or something like that? So we went the other way around, but at least there is more information. I don't know which one is more useful in the end, but there is information for the decision makers. And this is just a start. I mean, if it was for me, we would go fully quantitative benefit risk assessment, explaining whose preferences have we now taken into considerations as the ones that think that this is a positive benefit risk, and how are these described, how are they justified, how homogeneous are they in the population. There is a whole branch of work now, even at the level of the ICH, where we're going to do more work on that, and we're encouraging companies also to explore with this more quantitative benefit risk method. The other thing is, okay, describing uncertainties, are we good at it? And I don't think we're very good at it, because we actually don't have a single framework to follow when describing uncertainty. It's a very convenient term, uncertainty, but if you then dig down to how these are described, often it's an opaque term that doesn't communicate much. So actually, together with Lawrence Bloom from University of Utrecht, we are working, and many others, we are working on developing framework for classifying uncertainties. And so the last thing is the recognition that even if, let's say, the data are sufficient for a marketing authorization, there are still many questions that, even if they fall outside the strict remit of the regulators, they have huge impact on patients. For example, treatment duration, treatment dose. We go for one that is sufficiently okay for a marketing authorization, but all these things can be optimized. So how can we support mainly academia, I guess, in conducting such trials? And in summary, so I think the positive benefit risk assessment is the starting point, but we always have to ask ourselves how we make this assessment. And I think, in my experience in oncology, I think the most plausible question is, from a drug regulator's perspective, given the many other decision makers, the relevant question is, are there any patients in the right decision context who prefer the drug to placebo? If the answer is yes, then the benefit risk can be considered positive. The point is not to decide for everybody else. The point rather is to clearly communicate so that the other decision makers can make their decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesco. I'm looking very much forward to the panel discussion later on, because we have one speaker asking for a classification of the added benefit, and the EMA view is certainly the opposite. So I'm really looking forward to that.